What's going on, everybody? Today we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite subject, lighting. Now, lighting, as we all know, can really make or break your scene. It's a difference between having something that looks beautiful to having something that looks okay. So, today we're going to be taking a look at some of my techniques which I've used within virtual production to hopefully help you guys along on your journey for lighting and making prettier, better presentations for your environments. So, let's go ahead and get started. Here we are in Unreal Engine in this garden walk environment, which I created, and we're going to be redoing the lighting here. Now, one thing that's important to note about lighting is that there is no magic button, there's no press this and all your lighting, dreams will come true. It's really just adjusting levels, adjusting different parameters, really to get the look that you're going for. And my advice, especially for newer artists looking to become lighting artists, would be to actually study reference, keep reference on hand while lighting to sort of have a sort of bar to hit. And another thing I would say also, which is a very common mistake that a lot of people make, it's a mistake that I made early on in my career, is oftentimes these shadows in your scenes are actually too dark. It's a very common thing that happens. The actual ambience during the day, for example, if you just go outside and look under most lighting conditions, oftentimes there's a lot more ambience. The shadows are a bit more lifted. So just keep that in mind if you're going for like true photorealism, is to have a photorealistic reference to go based off of. But let's go ahead and dive right in. So first I'm going to do a little overview of this lighting, and then we're going to make a lighting scenario. So in this lighting scenario, what I did for this one, and it's a very common practice we do in virtual production, is we use path tracer to, not for a final render because it doesn't quite work for virtual production, but we do use it as a reference guide as far as how should our lighting be looking. And so that's another tip that I would give when lighting, whether you're going to use path tracing for your final render or not, have it enabled by going to not preferences, it's project settings, and making sure that use hardware ray trace when available is enabled, and this will enable you to use the path tracer. So if you see that path tracing isn't here, just go ahead and double check, make sure that you have path tracing enabled. And so when you're doing your lighting, you get it to the sort of final stage, it's looking how you want it to look, but you want to also measure it against something that has a bit more polish to it, perhaps. One good thing to do is go to path tracing and see how it looks in path trace. And then when doing that, all you need to do is go back into your lit mode and adjust your lights to actually look. You basically just dial in the parameters between your fog and your lights to get closer to that path tracing look. Now, while you're doing that, keep in mind that as you adjust your lights and as you flip back to path tracing, it's going to update in path tracer as well. So keep that in mind too, that it once you have path tracing looking how you want it to look, you can even take a screenshot of that and keep that as sort of your guide, because otherwise, yeah, you'll constantly be essentially chasing it until the path tracing, kind of like here, doesn't look as good anymore as lit. Whereas before I made the adjustments in the scene, path tracing for the most part kind of looked like this. But anyway, let me go through here, and there's another thing within this scene I want to show. And that is over here. Yeah, I need to change my camera speed, turn it down a little bit. Okay, there we go. Now it's too slow. A little bit faster. All right. So one thing I wanted to talk about as well before we rebuild our lighting is the actual, using accent lights and additional ambient lights to just sort of add more, just more contrast, more drama, whatever it is you might be looking for your lighting scenario. So, for example, in this lighting scenario, I have just a rectangle light and a spotlight. If I turn them off, by default, this is what this sort of gazebo looks like as you walk up to it. It's kind of obscured in a sense. It's we already have it covered in ivy, and it's a bit dark. And you could say, well, it's dark because it's being obscured by trees. Yes, but we could still push it to sort of exaggerate some of that sunlight onto it. And again, this is a common thing we do in virtual production is sort of painting with light, sort of pushing lights, even if the sunlight doesn't quote unquote actually hit it in the scene, still stylistically it's something that we might want to have. So here we just have, press G. Yeah, here we just have a spotlight, and it's just coming down and just sort of raking across the gazebo and just giving us a bit more of that sun hit. And the angle isn't exact, but it's still believable enough that it works. And it's at an angle which, me personally, I wanted. And since it's my scene, I'm going to keep it. But yeah, so just keep that in mind. Like, you're doing a daytime scene, for example, like this, that doesn't mean that you just have to only use directional light to get some directionality. You can accent things based on what you want the viewer to be looking at. And so, I wanted this to be more of a highlighted piece, so I added that. And additionally, come over here, and additionally, we have this rectangle light. And the rectangle light is what I commonly refer to as what would be known as an invisible light. It's not supposed to be so obvious that there is a light there. It's there mainly for ambience. And this rectangle light, if we look at it, it has a really low value, a value of 3, and it has a slightly bluish color, just to sort of match the ambient lighting temperature. So if we go down here and just make it white, it looks technically okay, right? Like, it doesn't look bad. But the problem with this is everything is now sort of the same tone, the same color. And so for me, I wanted to match the ambience a bit more. I didn't want to make it look like light was punching through here. I just wanted to make it look like the shadows were a bit lifted. So sort of matching that tone of the shadow, making a really soft, really gentle light in your shadows just to boost it a little bit can really go a long way. The other thing I'll mention before we dive right into it is the actual, where is it? Under film, this slope parameter. This is something that I often change. I usually turn it down to 0.7, 0.88, and this is just for the sake of contrast. If you're doing your color correction directly in Unreal Engine, we have all these color grading tabs and everything. And so if you're doing it that way, then you don't necessarily have to mind this too much. However, if you're going to be using like DaVinci Resolve or Premiere or whatever your editing software is, just lifting the shadows a little bit could just give you a bit more control over your color corrections. Now the darks, now we bring back some of that information that's sort of hiding in the shadows. And so, you don't want to turn this down too low, 0.5. It gets like pretty muddy, and we're not, we're not going for like a film codec, whatever. Like we're not trying to emulate like S-Log that Sony has or something. So we're just trying to lift the shadows a little bit. So give me a value of 0.7. And all right, let's go back over to the bridge area. Oh, made the camera slow, made the camera fast. There we go. Let's get back over here. All right, so let's go ahead and make a new lighting scenario. Do this, turn this off. And I'm gonna go ahead and delete all these. All right, so we got rid of our lights. Just say it's nighttime and you're done. I'm kidding. So what we're gonna do is bring in a directional light. All right. And then we're going to grab an HDRI backdrop. So you can use an HDRI like a sky sphere. That would work just as fine as well. For the sake of this and time, I'm just using the backdrop. In virtual production, we usually have custom sky spheres or whatever, but for this, also the other thing is right now it is way too small. Way too small. It's also still clipping, so we need to move it down a little bit still. Bring it down about right there. All right. So let's actually increase the size. Let's make it like 40,000. Okay. All right. And now we have a sky. I'm going to turn the directional light off real quick. And again, if you're going to use path trace to render, just doing HDRI lighting is probably the best way to do it. It just makes your scene look pretty good for just right out of the gate. The only thing, when you do the path tracer is like if you have nanite stuff, you have to turn the relative error on the mesh to 0 or to a lower number. Otherwise, you can get like low quality trees, for example. Or you just don't have nanite meshes and then you're good. But anyway, I'm going to go back to lit. And I'm going to decrease the intensity of this sky. Bring back some of that contrast. And the sky, actually, I don't like the sky. Let's do... We're going to use this Dawn HDRI. We're going to do more like a Dawn, whatever, sort of pinkish lighting. All right. And so what I want to do first is I want to sort of see where the sun is coming from, which direction. It's coming from pretty much straight back. So let's go ahead and rotate the sun to match the sky, or like right there. All right, and angle it a bit more. And then here's what I'm going to do. So if you want to rotate these, you could technically just grab both of them and rotate, and it's going to rotate both of them. The other thing you can do, which is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to grab a basic actor, and you probably want to put it at 0, 0, 0, but for now I want to see it, so I'm just going to keep it here. I'm going to name it to Sky Rotator. I'm just going to take the directional light, bring it in, movable, then the Sky HDR backdrop, set the scene component to movable, and we can drop this in as well. And now we have our custom rotator, our sky rotator, and now from here we can rotate. It's going to completely rotate the directional light. You could put this empty actor at the position of the directional light, but yeah, for right now, we're just going to rotate. Let's get in a better position. We can't really see the sky too well right now. This sky also is a lower resolution sky. You probably want to do a higher resolution one for sort of final render. But, all right, let's go ahead and just say that's fine. Next thing we're going to want to do. Nah, see, that's too bright. 0.25. 0.5. All right, so let's go to the skylight. We're going to set it to specified cube map, and we're going to find that Dawn HDRI. Okay, so from here, first, the directional light's being too, let's adjust this before we mess with that ambience, because it's too distracting. So since it's dawn, we want the shadows to be a bit softer. The hard sort of shadows is more like high noon. Like this kind of stuff is more like high noon. So let's increase this a bit. Just sort of play with the values. Again, this is where like having reference would be great if you're trying to go for a very specific photorealistic look, trying to emulate a specific environment, for example, then there's something to look at in the references. How soft are the shadows? How soft is the sunlight? What's the color of that sunlight? So just keep that in mind as well. So we're gonna adjust the color a bit. Just kind of ballpark it. It's okay. You don't want to go too saturated, not yet at least. So let's adjust the values here. Indirect lighting, create that to like 4. Okay, I'm gonna see what it looks like with path tracing. Okay, so, and again, using Path Tracer as a guide, we see that it's a bit more clear. We can see here right now our ambient light is way too dark. When we look at it through path tracing, it gives us like a little bit of lift, like right here, you can see it. We want it even brighter than this still, but still it gives us a nice guide, right? So if you ever get caught and you're like, how should I continue to push the lighting? I just flip back and forth between the path tracer. So I go back to skylight. Let's crank this up to something crazy real quick. Let's go to 10. Okay, yeah, way too high. And it's something I'll often do while I'm developing my environments, while I'm lighting them, is when I'm trying to find what the right balance is, if I don't inherently know it, which is very common, but if I don't just inherently know the number, then I'll do a number that I know is too high and then a number that I know is too low. Like, again, I know 10 is too high and I know 1 is too low. And so, okay, so what does 5 look like? So 5 looks all right. Might be a little dark over here. And so then again, come over here and let's push the directional a little bit. 6, I knew 6 would be too high. Let's go back to 4. Then also one thing you can do, also keep in mind, so let's say 6, what you can do, instead of turning down the intensities, you can turn down the color. And it'll do that for you. It gives you like a slightly different look than just turning down the intensity. Like it's pretty subtle, but still there. Okay, let's keep it about right there. And one thing I'm gonna try, and again, lighting is just about sort of playing with the lights, right? We're just having fun, trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. So for example, you could say, well, what does it look like if we just add a little bit more blue to the ambience? Let's go really blue. Oh, it's like, now it like hurts your eyes, it's so blue. And so yeah, so then you come back down, just add like a very slight tinge to it. There we go. Then I'm gonna see if there's a better sort of rotation and placement. Again, lighting is just about, it's more of like discovering, pretty much. You're kind of just discovering, what's the best placement, what's the best rotation, the best angle, because it's not always so obvious what those numbers are. And so just coming in here, bringing the lights in, playing with them, and seeing what works is kind of what it's all about. Oops. Accidentally turn that off. Let's angle it back. Something like there. Something like there. Let's look at path tracing. It's probably going to be a lot more ambient. Yep. Yeah, see, path tracing is really good with the overall ambience. It's also really great at like rendering foliage. Let's go back here. Okay, so looking at that, it's starting to get closer. The big difference is the softness of the shadows, and the overall ambience for path tracing is still a little bit higher. So let's go ahead and take those notes to heart. We're gonna come in here. I'm gonna increase the source angle a little bit more again. And then maybe even, again, try some crazy number. 20. It'll get like really blotchy if you use a number this high. But just look at the indirect and seeing, what would that look like? Just playing with it. 10, 8. All right. And then again, just boosting the ambience a little bit. Don't be afraid to increase this number. I know it can be really finicky, especially if you like move with a slider or go from like 0 to the moon like real quick. But it wasn't that much brighter, so we're just bringing in a little bit at a time. So 8. I think 8 is about right. But again, it's just about playing with it. Like, even if I know, like, okay, I think that's right, I'll still push it a little bit further just to see. Looking at that's like, okay. So looking at the bridge, this looks fine, but then the problem with this is this whole area over here, it's not looking that great anymore. So let's go ahead. What was it? It was back at 5. Yeah, let's bring this up to 8. 7. Okay, let's look at it through a camera. All right, and then the other thing we want to add is an exponential height fog. And I purposefully waited to like the end basically to add it, this as well as the post-process in the volume. I did that for a specific reason. Because the first thing we need to figure out is the sky. Sky sort of comes first. I mean, first thing we bring in is directional light, but first thing for me that I like to try to figure out is what sort of sky do I want? Because then the sky will help guide your actual lighting. If you start with lights first, and especially if you plan on working with HDRIs, if you start with a light first, and then you place the sun exactly where you want it, and then you're like, well, oh no, I cannot find, an HDRI that works with this. Oh, now I have to do X, Y, and Z. If you start with the sky first, it'll help give you sort of creative constraints. This is what I like to call them. It'll help give you these sort of creative constraints for your environment that will say, okay, well, I know, I love this sky, and I know the sun is going to be roughly about this high. And so, yeah, so then you can work within those constraints. It's kind of like how the real world works, right? So that's why I like to start from the sky first. And then, I put the directional light sort of in line with where the sun would be in that sky. And then, then we move it into place. We find a good rotation for it. Then we work on the ambience. And then last thing we do is work on the fog and the post-process. So again, come in here, add volumetric fog. And that's starting to help. That's starting to help a lot, actually. So we have that in here. In our directional light, we want to use light shaft occlusion. And then we want to use light shaft bloom. And if you're looking at your scene and you're like, well, I don't really see much going on when I press these buttons, just go ahead and adjust the numbers. If you like rotate the light, if I rotate the directional light after doing that, it might still work. Or if we turn it like to ourselves, yeah, it seems to be just fine. All right. That hot hit on the bridge. There we go. Wait. There we go. That's better. Now there's a better balance of which kind of luck with this tree being here, giving us a nice sort of breakup on the bridge. So this way, whereas before when it's, and this is more of a talk of composition and sort of how your eyes like to look at things. But if we had it like this, for example, which looks fine, the problem with this is because of how hot the bridge is now, your eyes just want to look at this. Whereas when we cast a shadow on it, a larger shadow on it, your eyes will look here, but now it isn't just the focus, right? And it also kind of gives us this opportunity for this nice sort of S curve a little bit. This one doesn't really take us in this direction. It kind of just keeps flowing, but it still does this sort of design. Again, this one kind of by luck. I wish I could say it was by design that I'm that good, but you know, it's happy little accidents, right? But okay, so we got our fog in here, and we have our directional light. And again, you can change if you want like more God rays. You could really bump this up. And then same with the occlusion mask. If you want to mask more, mask less, you can. All right, so that's looking all right. So let's come in here, and last step is add a post process, which is kind of reverse, right? Most people add post process volume first, whereas here I'm adding the post process volume last. Well, why am I adding it last? So the reason I'm adding it last is because post process, kind of in the name post, sort of after the fact. These are all sort of overlaid effects that that run things like color correction, chromatic aberration, vignette, things like that. And so, as you can see, I'm very intentional with also the order in which I'm doing things. Again, sky, then sun, then ambient, then fog, and then post process, because the post process is what's going to give us that final little boost in our look. And so again, film, come over here, drop it to 0.7, just gives it all a little bit of lift. And looking at this, it's like, well, I did like it better at 0.88. It looked better, the contrast. But again, if you plan on color correcting in another software, just boosting it up again, 0.7 for example, helps me personally. And because I do color corrections in DaVinci Resolve, for example, outside of like bloom, and even sometimes I do the bloom in DaVinci Resolve, but things like bloom and the film stuff, the slope, is really all I adjust within here. Okay, this is like too dreamy, fairy tale like. Me personally though, I do like, for like my personal work, I do like a sort of soft, dreamy feel. You'll probably notice that when you when you look at my work, and as I release more and more stuff, you'll see that I have a little bit of bloom in like everything. So yes, I'm aware that my images are glowing. That's how I like it. Don't judge me. Where is this? Okay, so now we have it set up. We're looking at it, and this tree has some problems. But we'll focus on that later. But we're looking at it, and now it's a little bit washed out, right? So now again, this is when you come back in here and you just start again just playing with the settings. Also, the sky might be a little too dark based on how bright this all is. Go to 1. Yeah, okay. Let's go here. 1. Or what was that? 6. Let's grab the indirect down to 1. There we go. That's a little better. And now we have this sort of poof. That's what happens when you have the bloom up really high. I was waiting for this moment. Yeah, so let's go down here. Let's fix this bloom scale. There we go. And even for this point, whoops, not 0.5, 0.05. We don't need it to be that much. And we can go through the scene, sort of look. If you guys saw my video, the render I did for this, it was like a walking path. So again, if you have your sequence sort of planned out, then, and it's for example, a path like this, then make sure to go through and double check the lighting in each of those areas. Make sure that it's looking how you want it to. Here. And once again, I'd probably adjust the gazebo. I'd end up adjusting the fog because over here it's looking a bit flat now. And then the other thing I wanted to show is I have a lighting scenario that I built from a reference, which is from, where is it? This night lighting, which was inspired by that New Orleans style environment from Red Dead Redemption 2. I remember first time I went there in the game, it's like the city street lights were glowing. It was like misty and all that. And this, again, if let me open this, take a look at what's going on here. So as we can see, it's the same setup as my other environment. The only difference is that I have a bunch of point lights for the street lamps, and they're all casting, you know, volumetric shadows, or not volumetric shadows, my bad, volumetric lighting. And then, the funny thing is the sky, the HDRI for this one, I couldn't find a proper night sky HDRI, so I actually used the approaching sky or approaching storm HDRI. This one comes with Unreal Engine, I believe. Um, and as we can see, the intensity is like nothing, 0.0005. But if I turned it to 0, then we wouldn't get that sort of moonlight. And I wanted to have a sense of like knowing where this is coming from. And so that's really all I needed it for. So I could have technically used any other HDRI. This was already in there and it worked. But yeah, if I turn it to like 1, it's like glowing and bright, and it's a daytime sky. But yeah, let's bring that back. But then the skylight, I used this clear noon, and I really just use this clear noon just for the color. I wanted there to be a contrast of the sort of warm and cool tone in here. And so I used that HDRI, the sort of clear, what was it, clear noon? Yeah, I used that, just gave it a really low intensity of like 0.2. And if we give it an intensity of 0, for example, like if we come over here and like, say we look at the ground, it makes everything just straight up black. So we want to make sure that we have a little bit going on. And then the directional light, again, super low. And then I also gave it just a really a low valued blue. And, cause by default, if we just had it at 2.5 and just, let's say we made it white, by default, this is what the sunlight would give us in this scene, the sort of nighttime scene. But again, just changing the color to a darker blue, gives us that nighttime feel. So keeping that in mind. And then, the funny thing here is the Lumen version, in my opinion, actually looks better than the path traced version. The path tracing will always give you better volumetric fog, but the actual lighting overall, the Lumen scene actually provided what I wanted. But yeah, so in closing, proper order of operations, choosing a sky first, whether if you're not using HDRI, you could use sky atmosphere. But if you're using an HDRI, choose your sky first, choose your directional light, then work on your ambient light, your skylight, then into height fog, and then you do post-processing. And following that order of operation, you sort of balance as you go. So you balance the sky, you balance the sun, you balance the skylight, you balance the fog, you balance the post-process. Once you finish with that part, then you go back and you start fine-tuning everything else, right? Once you get the individual pieces how you want them, and then they start to kind of fit together, then you go back and make them more homogeneous. So keep that in mind. I'll also be in the description down below. I'll also be having links to some great resources for free Sky HDRIs, which y'all